gives me a really great pleasure to invite Miles Scott to the stage. Miles is the Chief Exec of Maidstone and Tunbridge Wells NHS Trust, a significant experience as a leader across the system, and I'm really delighted he's been able to make it today to kind of talk through his experiences within his organisation of practical implications of delivering improved workforce. Thank you very much, Miles.
Thank you. Thanks very much indeed, Mark. Just before I start, I would really like to get a bit of a feel for who we've got in the room today. So, because I saw the list of who's invited, but that's not always the same thing as who shows up. So, and I think it might also be interesting for you all to see who you all are. So, who here is a kind of a Ned or a governor? Okay. Who here is from a nurse leadership position? That's most people. Workforce? That's most other people. Any other professional group? Okay, a couple of AHPs and one or two others. That's really, really helpful. I think the reason I was asked to talk to you today, apart from being a kind of jobbing chief executive, is that it would help if I turn these the right way around, wouldn't it? So, as well as being a jobbing chief executive, I had the privilege actually of chairing the Nice Safe Staffing Committee five years ago, so I spent quite a lot of time looking at a lot of these issues. So, what I'm going to do today is I'm actually going to start with that. I'm just going to give you a few reflections from that experience five years ago. What I'm then going to do is talk a little bit about what I think some of the kind of the board and actually stretch that out to governors, what some of the board considerations are and what we might be looking for in taking forward this guidance. And then I'm going to share with you some of what we do at Maidstone and Tunbridge Wells, or MTW as we call it, not because I think we're great paragons of virtue, but because I hope it will begin to surface both what are some of the things that everybody in this room has actually achieved over the last five years in relation to safe staffing, but also what are the challenges, and what I'd like to do is actually get you all to start to voice some of the good practice, but also some of the challenges that you're currently working on. So if I start with the Nice Say Staffing, I mean, it does feel like this was the kind of the guidance that dare not speak its name for a while. We worked kind of furiously hard. We published stuff. We developed other stuff that was ready to go, and then it was all a bit inconvenient. And as a consequence, it was kind of rather unceremoniously dropped. And it's been interesting actually on a personal basis to see how it's slightly come back into vogue actually, and you are at least allowed to read what was written, and some of what we did has been built on in terms of later guidance, and I think there are some reflections that are quite worth picking out. So the first for me was this whole question of evidence. What evidence really is there around safe staffing, particularly in nursing and midwifery? And there's an awful lot of published stuff, but actually the quality of a lot of that published evidence was quite difficult to use in the way that I think the government had anticipated that we would use it. So it's no great secret that the Secretary of State at the time, Jeremy Hunt, was very keen that we came up with some nurse staff ratios that we could publish, and that everybody in the NHS could be held to account to, and the evidence didn't point us in that direction, and there were a lot of people in the kind of academic community who were saying, well, the evidence isn't really there to come up with guidance, national guidance at all. But I think that's not right. There is a lot of published evidence out there. It is of differing quality. But there are a number of insights that come from the evidence that's really worth holding on to, and really worth making sure that people in your board and, frankly, nurses and other staff in your organisation are aware of. And I've just picked out here, I'm not suggesting these are all the bits of evidence there are, all these necessarily the most important ones, but these are ones that stuck with me over the last 5 years, things that really kind of came home to me, despite having worked in the NHS for 25 years at that point, that really came home for me as a result of doing that work. And the first one was this whole kind of concept of what is a staffing sensitive indicator. it's clear that falls and pressure ulcers are seriously sensitive to nurse staffing levels, and they are the indicators that are really worth looking at in terms of trying to understand what's going in your nurse staffing levels. Other quality indicators mostly aren't actually very sensitive to staffing. That doesn't mean to say that you shouldn't use them, that you shouldn't look at them. It doesn't mean to say they're of no use. But what it does mean is there are lots of confounding variables, and they are unlikely to do more than raise a question for you, and actually getting people like NEDs, and even getting, frankly, in our experience, some of the frontline staff really to hook on to the importance of what some of these indicators are, and which of these indicators really link to staffing levels. I think another really big message that comes from all of the international evidence is that the links between nurse staffing and safety are absolutely driven by registered nurse numbers. And there's some really good work internationally around the role of non-registered support professions, and frankly, the evidence is very clear that when it comes to looking at safety issues, it's the registered nurse numbers that count. Now, that may be really obvious to most people in this room, but I don't think that is necessarily as obvious as that to everybody that you're engaging with. And you know, somebody who works as a support worker on a regular basis, that isn't to suggest that our support workers don't have a really valuable role, but it does mean that when we're looking at these important safety issues, that it's the registered nurse numbers that really count. And I think the other thing that really came out for me from the evidence, which has really stayed with me, is this whole issue about the relationship between safety and staffing numbers, and that it's not linear. It is not as straightforward. And again, this may seem obvious to people, but it's not as straightforward as the more staff you've got, the more safe you are. The fewer staff you've got, the less safe you are. And what this little chart tries to show is that one of the things that came out very clearly from the NICE work is that there's effectively a tipping point. So when you're relatively well staffed and you have high levels of quality and safety, taking staff, reducing your staffing levels doesn't actually, for the first at the higher levels, reducing your staffing levels doesn't have that big an impact on safety overall. But you get to a point where there's like a tipping point. And that when we looked at a range of studies, there is a tipping point in that relationship between staffing levels and safety, where suddenly it all becomes very serious indeed, and taking any hours out of that establishment or out of that shift has a dramatic and serious impact on staffing levels. And we tried quite hard to see if we could estimate where that tipping point was, and actually that was really difficult to do. I think we almost said that the much vaunted 1 in 8 ratio is kind of at or just beyond the tipping point in the great majority of cases, and of course in many higher dependency areas, then the tipping point is at a much lower ratio than that. But I think the point about that was getting people to have that tipping point concept in their mind, because that's one of the things that you all as workforce and nursing directors and other colleagues need to understand. Where is your tipping point? And helping people like matrons and ward managers to understand where their tipping point is, because the fact that these tipping points exist is really well evidenced. And so I think one of my reflections for all of this is that clearly we've got this guidance that's coming out from NHS Improvement, and you know, it's well written, and I'm sure you've all read it. It is worth going back to some of the evidence. It is worth going back to maybe some of the nice stuff, but also looking at some of the other published evidence around. Certainly, personally, I found the work of Peter Griffiths and Jane Ball in Southampton extremely helpful, particularly in their kind of meta-analyses of different studies. And of course, other nursing research is available, but it is worth, I think, taking the time to look at that. I think the final couple of bullet points here are really very much been touched on by Mark. But what came across was that because the nature of the evidence is that what is safe will vary a lot on local conditions. The importance of judgment and use of judgment and understanding the basis on which you are using your judgment really came to the fore, and emphasising the importance therefore of process in setting standards, and of course that's now reflected in the NQB triangle approach in terms of making sure that you've got an evidence-based tool, that you are using professional judgment, and that you are looking at quality indicators. And I think the triangulation point is also well made and often made. I think the point I would want to make about that is how can we make sure that we aren't just using those triangulation that triangulation method in looking at annual plans or in looking even in our monthly board papers, but how can we help matrons and ward managers actually triangulate on a daily basis or on a real time basis, how they bring those different factors together. So that's where the concept of red flags came in, and people have taken that concept and run with it. I was very struck in the document, actually, the Sherwood Forest Hospital SOP for safe staffing, and the thresholds that they'd actually published within their organisation, which seemed to me to have something significant to offer. So those are just a few reflections on the work that, I'd say, was done 5 years ago, but much of which I think has been brought into the NQB and other work since then. So, and I'm going to change gear slightly and ask you to think a bit about where might boards be coming from. I appreciate most people in this room need to be involved in this work at an incredibly granular and often quite operational level. But what you also need to be able to do is help your boards make sense of all of this, and help your boards fulfil their own role. And I think it's very easy with boards to assume that they know what they want, they know what questions they want to ask, they know what data they want to see. And actually, they often need quite a lot of help in thinking that through. So Mark has touched on some of this, so I'll try not to repeat too much of what he said, but I think there are some issues in here that are worth working through. So I think the starting point really for boards is this whole question about how can we get at least a reasonably objective basis for setting establishments and for staffing levels on operational basis. And clearly you can think of those in terms of the potential poles of what a productivity, or if you like a Carter a requirement and approach might be, but also what a safety, a quality and a Francis requirement might be. What boards then need to do is they really need help in actually understanding what's important, being able to see the woods for the trees, and certainly I think when I've looked at board reports, including I think to an extent our own, it's very easy to present people with endless scorecards and tables and all the rest of it, and really actually pulling out for members of the board what's important and why is really significant. And I think that constant emphasis on your judgment is really significant. Clearly, there's a very, very important role around assurance in all of this, and I think that Mark and others talked about regulation, talked about the need for assurance, the single oversight framework, and how all of this is going to be brought into that. And clearly, that needs to be done in a sensible way, and be very focused on risks. And one of the things that Claire and Simon over there from MTW are bored of hearing me talk about when considering risk is the importance of thinking about not just what your risk is, but thinking separately about what are your controls and then what are your mitigations, and that differentiating between those two. So controls being things that you do to control the risk, to stop the risk materialising. And then mitigations being actions that you will take for those risks that do materialise, and trying to get people to separate those two things out. Very often people talk about mitigations or controls in a kind of rather loose way, and trying to separate out how you will prevent the risk from materialising from what you will do when risks do materialise, because some risks are going to materialise. I hope is quite a helpful way of thinking about it. But it seems to me that it's really important that boards go beyond their assurance function. And I know a lot of non-executive directors, you give them a wodge of papers and a load of graphs and they're away. And you've got 1,000 questions and it's all about how you make sure this never ever happens again, or, why is this ward 0.7 over something lower than this ward, and all the rest of it. And actually, I think one of the important takeaways for everybody here is to make sure that the work that you do for your board helps the board to go beyond assurance. How's the board going to use your staffing work actually to think about improvement? So what about all those green rated wards? How are we going to use any of these data to improve what we're doing for all of our patients and for the staff who work in those areas, rather than just only look at the reds? I think a really important issue for me as well is, how do we use this information, these data, for engagement? And certainly an experience I think that we had in MTW was that when we went into financial special measures and inevitably we were having to look at a range of establishments, actually following the NQB logic was hugely important in engaging and generating confidence among the nursing profession across the organisation, and is something that we've then tried to replicate in reviews of other staffing groups as well. So those are some of the considerations I think for boards, and probably councils or governors as well, for those of you from FTs as well as for boards. What I'm now going to do is just share a little bit of what we're doing in MTW, but as I say, using that more to kind of prompt what have we actually achieved, but also where are we challenged, and what are we doing next? And I think what we do as a board would probably be very familiar to most of you. I think hopefully we're on the right side of Mark's audit over there in terms of what we do and don't look at on a monthly basis. But essentially we have an annual workforce plan, and then we have monthly reporting against a range of indicators, and we're using the Quest tool. We're reporting against care hours per patient day, and we're reporting the sensitive indicators. So there's some narrative out of which we pull actions and if you like, our worry ward list, as Mark was talking about earlier. But we also have a scorecard, and this is what our scorecard looks like. And again, I'm sure that you've all got something very, very similar to this, but essentially, we're picking out every ward, and we're identifying where we're at in terms of fill rate, where we're at in terms of care hours per patient day, the nurse sensitive indicators, the friends and family test, the Quest score, and also where we're at financially in relation to that ward. And as I say, I'm sure most, if not all of you, have got something very similar already up and running. I think the question is, what do we do with all these data? And what, if anything, have we actually changed? Again, going back to my kind of assurance challenge a little bit. Assurance is really important. I'm not suggesting for a minute that it's not. But actually, if we haven't changed anything as a result of all this blooming assurance, then we've kind of missed the point. So my last two slides just say something about some of the things I think we have been able to achieve locally, and then some of the questions. And then I want to try and get some examples from yourselves. So I think the first thing is, there's no doubt within our organisation we have now got, I think, pretty good triangulation with the nurse sensitive quality indicators between staffing levels at an operational level and the more sensitive quality indicators, and we can do that monthly, but we also use that in an operational way, and I think that's been the critical thing. That's what has enabled us to work with the board in terms of what should you read into this? I think we'll come on to this in a minute, but I think actually even with that quite limited data set. There are still some quite interesting questions about, what do these data what do these data tell us? And the honest answer is we don't really know. I don't know about anybody else in the room, but I think, we think that the care hours per patient day and the model hospital stuff is great. It's really, really, really rich data source. We've yet really to use those data effectively to change our practice in a number of areas. And one of the bits bits of feedback I'd be really interested in is people who've used that, really just the model hospital and the CHPPD stuff really to change what they're doing. But we have used some of these data sets to drive our thinking. We use the Quest tool to get underneath what's going on in those wards that we think may be in some kind of difficulty. And there's no doubt that Claire and her team have actually really driven action out as a result of some of these analyses. So, I've lifted there an example of revising our policy for assigning enhanced care. That was a direct product of Claire and her team going through that scorecard that I just showed you, and that wouldn't have happened without going through that approach. I referenced this a few minutes ago, but setting and reviewing establishments. I mentioned the fact that we had to do a big establishment review as part of being in financial special measures, and actually having a proper basis for doing that, and for justifying investment as well as areas where we could identify productivity opportunities was important, and that's now living in terms of these twice yearly reviews. So I think, again, I suspect this is true for many of you. I think we can now say that we've really embedded the NQB guidance in what we're doing, particularly for nursing and midwifery. I completely take Mark's challenge that we've a lot more to do to roll that out with other professions, and I think it is important that we've hardwired establishments with rosters and with the electronic staff record, as well as with expenditure, and pulling those four data sets together and really understanding the links between them, I think, has been hugely important. And then finally, clearly we are now using these approaches in terms of business planning, and that includes developments and budget setting, as well as looking at quality issues. So here are just some of the challenges that I think we particularly face at the moment. So CHPPD, I've already mentioned. We think it's great. We think there's really rich data set. We think we've got a lot to learn about how to use it really effectively, and would be really interested in other people's experience of doing that. There are a whole range of new roles, and Mark's presentation particularly talked about these. In practice, how you reflect some of those new roles in these data is, again, quite a challenge. And as we move to more multidisciplinary working in our clinical areas, that's a specific challenge. And it's not just about multi-professional teams. It's actually about how do we apply this logic to other professions. And as I say, warts and all, I think we're much further down the road with nursing and midwifery than we are with most of our other clinical professions. And then finally, really being able to be sensitive around acuity and dependency in the range of settings that we've got is something that I guess it's one of those areas where you have to apply a lot of judgment, and that's an area where we're looking to develop. So those are some thoughts about kind of what I learned from doing the nice Say Stomping work 4 or 5 years ago, some reflections on what boards might be after, and some of the both the achievements, but also the challenges of implementing this within an organisation like our own. So, what I'd like to do now is really kind of throw this open to the floor, because I think it'd be really helpful to get your experience into this. And clearly, if anybody's got any questions about anything I've presented, I'd be more than happy to answer those. But I think it would be useful for you all to hear from one another. So I've got a couple of questions that I'd like you to think about, and then we'll open it out. And we've got roving mics so that we can play you in. So I think I've got 4 questions. The first is, what have you done that has generated confidence between board and ward? So what have you done over the last couple of years in this space that's really generated that confidence in either direction? Second question is, how have your safe staffing initiatives actually improved patient and staff experience? So not just demonstrated where you do and don't have good and bad patient and staff experience, but have you used these initiatives actually to improve things? My third question would be, what do you find most challenging in meeting your own or national requirements for safe staffing? And my fourth question is, what developments and opportunities are you exploring currently that you would like to share with the rest of the audience that you think will help you to address some of those challenges? Okay, so I think we've got, according to the programme, we've got about 10 minutes. So who wants to kick off? Who's got some experience they want to share, or some questions that they want to pose to the rest of the audience? Hi, there's a lady at the front here. I'm sorry, would you mind just saying who you are and where you're from? It would be really helpful.
Thank you. Yes, my name is Lynn Andrews. I'm Director of Nursing at Chesterfield. Just one of the things that we shared at the board was we didn't really do a really good job where we closed one of the wards recently. It was a ward where patients went when they were medically stable, but it's part of our discharge processes. And we didn't do that in a particularly well way. And so we took the story to board, and both our staff partnerships were there as well as the clinical staff, and presented the cases between them. And I think that's a really powerful message to say this is where things haven't gone well and what we're going to do differently about it, and share the lessons that are learned. And that really engaged the board with clinical practice and the circumstances, which I thought was really good. So
that's great to share that. And could you say anything about what you did learn? You know, what are you doing differently as a consequence of having been so honest about that?
Yeah, well, the QIA was one of the key things. Whilst it was in train, it hadn't gone through in a timely manner. So that was one of the things, was about doing that up front and being clearer. The other was around the timing of it.
Yeah.
And one of the issues there was about, while some of the staff knew, because it had been talked about as part of our plan, our strategic plans, that ongoing effective communication hadn't taken place. So when it came to the conversations that were going to do it, and the timescales we did in, which was quite short, that was quite a sort of different feel for the staff than what perhaps they'd had originally thought of and intended. So that was a very good one. And using staff partnership, our colleagues there as well, to support the discussions and the actions we were taking. These were all key things.
Brilliant. Thank you very much indeed. Thanks for sharing that. Who else has got some good practice? You've got to have some good practice. You can't have coffee until we've got some good practice out on the table. Who's got some good practice that they want to share, or something they're working on that they just think other people might be interested in? All right, so another lady here.
Sorry, you'll have to excuse me, I've got a bit of a sore throat. My name's Helen Judkins. I'm the Assistant Director of Nursing at the Luton and Dunstable Hospital. And it's really, from what Mark said earlier on about assurance, and the worry wards. So how do we assure our board around our worry wards and about the metrics that you spoke about? So we developed a clinical leadership and development nurse 2.5 years ago. And the role is that Anne goes into a ward and works with staff to support them, and looking at the quality metrics, and gives a report to the board around how we can improve that with staffing, what needs to go in, have we got the skill mix right, what can we do differently. And I think our board have really realised that from ward level up to board level, it's really, really important that they understand those areas where we have challenges every day and we don't never always get it right. Somebody going in to guide and support makes a real difference. And I think that even the non-execs have really enjoyed sort of hearing the stories about how we turn wards around and giving people support to do that.
That's a really good example. Just before you put the microphone down, do you think it's worked in the other direction at all? So what have the nursing staff at close to the front line got out of you having that role?
I think, most nursing staff on the ward often feel that there is a bit of a disconnect from the board, and some of probably the senior nursing team as well. So I think they feel really that we really understand what's going on their area. And we've had some really good stories that we've shared across the organisation around, you know, perhaps a leader sometimes that's new into post who can't turn around those really challenging staffing issues. And we recognise that sometimes we didn't get establishment right. So I think they really feel now that when this nurse goes on and does some work, it's not that they're a poor ward, because sometimes the metrics isn't too bad. It's just that we have that feeling that when we look at everything, that there's something not quite right there. And it's been a really, really good role, really good improvement. In fact, the nurse that embarked on this programme has recently done her master's degree and used that as her dissertation and has won an award.
Great. Okay. Well, thank you very much.
Quality improvement.
That's great. So that was Luton and Dunstable. It was a really nice example. Okay. Go on, we've got a lady over here with a hand up.
Hi, I'm Chief Nurse at Royal Papworth Hospital, Josie Rudman, just to talk about care hours for Patient Day. We flipped that on its head about 8 years ago, looking at my colleague to my right. I think it was about 8 years ago, and we did a lot of work around articulating how many care hours each patient needs on the ward. So where you've got interpretation of care hours per patient day, we've done an awful lot of work around that, and we actually use care hours per patient day as a establishment tool. So we can it helps you articulate the registered nurse to patient ratio, the staff to patient ratio, and so not waiting for the NHSI figures to come back to you to tell you what your care hours per patient day should be. We can actually articulate each ward's average care hour per patient day.
That's fantastic. And if people looked at your website, do you think from your board papers or something like that, they'd be able to work out, to get some idea of how you were doing that?
Yes.
Okay. No, brilliant. Okay, so that was Papworth. So again, if you maybe be the only person in the room who doesn't understand how to use CHPPD as an effective improvement tool, but there's definitely food for thought on Papworth. Right, we've got time probably for one more experience. So we've got we're going to take two actually, because I think we've got time for two. We've got a lady here and then one in the front row as well. And everybody on the left is going to have to be much more vocal in the next session, by the way. Right.
Hi, Suzanne Banks, Chief Nurse at Sherwood Forest.
Hi, Suzanne.
So we developed the Safe Stomping safeguards. Just to say, actually, we've moved from doing it, so the work that we've done up to date has been collecting that manually, and we're now in the process of moving that to use e-rostering. So those who've got e-rostering, once we've got it slick, we'll be able to share that and people will be able to use it electronically.
So those thresholds that are published in the document, you're now building those into the ESR, the rostering tool, sorry.
The rostering.
Wow.
And so that literally with the intention is that by the flick of a button we'll get our position at any time in the day. So
fantastic. That would be great, and particularly I guess it's people are developing control rooms and all that kind of stuff around the place. It would be really good to see that kind of information there. Okay, that's another take home for me. I can see Simon busy, furiously writing all these examples down. So yes, we'll have got good value for our train fares from MTW, I have to say, from you all. Right, we've got one more question here, and then I really am going to let you have a cup of coffee.
Hi, I'm Sam Foster, Chief Nurse in Oxford. So it's work in progress, this one. 12 months ago, we had quite a difficult CQC system-wide review that shared that relationships were fairly poor and patients weren't moving through the system. So over the course of the last year, we've been working really hard at how we review our stranded patients with health and social care colleagues, which I think has given us a much more of an evidence base about what patients are waiting for. We've employed a winter director who's got a fairly significant chunk of the pooled budget, and I think that the model hospital has shared lower quartile support workers in our trust and given us probably much more evidence around how we care for patients that are waiting. And we're certainly looking to share examples from other trusts about how they're caring for patients within hospital accommodation who don't need acute care, because we tend to rate all these patients as 1Bs. And I think we will probably not have a winter ward. That's certainly our aim, that we don't have one of those dreadful pop-up flex wards that gives poor care. So I think the stranded review and using model hospital data as a system will improve patient care for us.
Great. Okay, so that was an Oxford example, and definitely be interested in pursuing that personally. So, right, thank you all for bearing with us all. So I think it's now time for coffee.